Hi, welcome to the webinar on the Heritage Fund. I'm Jessica Feldt, Preservation Initiatives Manager at Preservation Maryland. Thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully this will answer a bunch of your questions that you have about the Heritage Fund. As part of my job here, I do manage the Heritage Fund, so when you have questions about it, I would be the correct person to contact, and I will have my contact information up at the end of the webinar. There is a funding round coming up due September 15th and a new application form, so we thought this would be a good opportunity to review the basics of the Heritage Fund and try to answer some commonly asked questions. So we will get started. I'd like to start with some background on the Heritage Fund. The Heritage Fund is a joint program of the Maryland Historical Trust and Preservation Maryland. The Maryland Historical Trust is the state historic preservation agency. We are the nonprofit historic preservation organization. It started in 1996 with both organizations contributing an investment to the fund. Through our agreement with the Maryland Historical Trust, Preservation Maryland handles the administration of the program. This fund provides direct assistance for Maryland's cultural and historical resources. And you'll hear me say this over and over and over again, it's a really diverse funding source. So there's lots of things you can do with the Heritage Fund. The Heritage Fund is set apart from other grant programs by the simplicity and rapid turnaround of the program. The time from the application deadline to award decision is typically around 8 weeks or so. And once your project is complete and we have all the required information from you, the funds are quickly distributed from Preservation Maryland. The other unique aspect about the Heritage Fund is the variety of projects that we fund. We'll discuss this more in a moment, but the Heritage Fund is a way to get projects that are harder to find funding sources for off the ground. You will hear me talk a lot today about the committee. So who is the committee? They are the people who decide the allocation of grant funds. The committee consists of members appointed by the Maryland Historical Trust and Preservation Maryland. The group represents a range of preservation perspectives and fields of expertise and geographic location. Committee members serve a 2-year term. So for a small grants program, the Heritage Fund has a large impact. Since its inception, the fund has distributed over $1 million to projects and has leveraged over $18 million in total project costs. Every county in Maryland has received grants. As the Heritage Fund can apply to lots of different kinds of resources, it has impacted an enormous variety of projects. In the last round alone, we funded a historic landscape documentation project, a barn, a theater, a conference, and an ark, among many other projects. We will now go into the ins and outs of the grant, answering questions like, is this right for your project? Do you have what you need to apply? And what happens after you submit your application? There are some basics to start with. Again, this is a quick and easy grant. You do not need to be an experienced grant writer to complete this grant. You can approach the questions using some of the techniques you might have covered in persuasive writing when you were in high school. A lot of the success of a grant application comes from having a well thought out project and clearly articulating its merits to the committee. Next, the grant funding is distributed in 2 rounds each year, one in the spring and one in the fall. The fall 2017 round has a September 15th due date. The spring 2018 deadline will be March 16th, and then there'll be another one in September of 2018. We award grants from $1,000 to a maximum of $10,000, and there must be a 10% match for your grant. The grant is open to nonprofit organizations and local jurisdictions, so private homeowners and businesses are not eligible to apply. Churches do fall under nonprofits and therefore are eligible to apply. Next, the money distributed by the Heritage Fund is reimbursable. Once your project is complete, or if you have multiple phases for your project, once the phase the grant funds is complete, you'll get in touch with us and supply us with proof of payment, some brief information about your completed project, and we can then issue you a check. Lastly, the Heritage Fund grant is valid for 1 year. So if you're applying for a project, please evaluate the work and see if what you're applying for is feasible in a 1-year window. And I would like to say everything, this is probably the big website to write down, and we'll have it again at the end. Our website has the full guidelines and application along with past projects. And looking at past projects is a great way to see what kinds of work have been funded and provide some inspiration when you're looking at what kind of projects you're seeking funding for. And we will put this website up again at the end of the webinar. If you're applying for a grant, please consult this website regularly while you work. So we'll go into, is my project eligible? So there's a lot of eligibility requirements, and they're all under the guidelines and application tab on our website, so I'm not going to read them all out here. But you can see there are lots of projects that fall under the Heritage Fund. It not only funds the bricks and mortar work of preserving resources, grants can also fund projects like feasibility studies, structural assessments, educational initiatives, archaeology, organizational development. And I'm going to sound like a bit of a broken record as we move on, but this is a very, very flexible grant, and I would encourage you to use it strategically, especially with a large project. Large projects can have lots and lots of phases, and they can also have lots of setup work that needs to happen and lots of work at the end. So really about how this grant and its unique characteristics can help your project. So sorry, this went a little slower than I thought, so we'll move on to the next one. What is organizational development? Because that is one thing that the Heritage Fund can fund. It's a big one that sometimes gets overlooked as well. If you have a small house museum, for instance, that you're trying to get off the ground, we can fund organizational development and help train to help grow the group as a preservation partner. It can mean working with a consultant to enhance your board or volunteer base, or develop a strategic plan to provide a framework for the organization moving forward. It can mean developing membership strategies, marketing or media plans, or fundraising activities. I will also add that collaborative projects are strongly encouraged. So team up with other organizations, schools, businesses, agricultural programs, just use your imagination what other groups in your area might be sympathetic to your grant and who you can work with. It's always a plus to see involvement in the project outside the applicant organization. We'll now turn to the application process itself. We use an online form that you can find a link to on our website. The first thing that if you've talked to me before, you've probably heard me say this, I would urge you to do is to craft your long form answers in your favorite word processor, Google Docs, Word, whatever you use to write. Because there is no save form on this button. We wish it had it, but unfortunately it does not. So please do draft them in something else so you can save your work. Because otherwise, if there's a disruption to your work while you're in the grant, you would lose all your work, and no one wants that. So please craft the long answers in a separate place so you can just cut and paste them into the grant. This is what the online form kind of looks like a little section, and I just wanted to highlight a couple things about it. Please pay attention to any gray boxes that may appear. You'll see them as you hover into there. They have instructions that will help you. So for example, the example I have up here is that there's this little quirk that we discovered when we were testing it, that when you put in your amount of grant request, it does not like it if you put in a dollar sign in front of that number. And if you click submit, it'll come up with an error, and it doesn't mean that everything gets wiped out, but it's just kind of annoying. So we put a little warning there saying, do not put in the dollar sign. And you'll see other little things like that that'll help you hopefully be able to avoid having to go back and resolve errors if you just make sure that anytime a gray box, you read it and follow those instructions. The other thing I want to bring attention to is that there's a maximum allowed 300 words for the long form answers. So when you do craft these in a separate document, please make sure that you're paying attention to your word count as well. And the final restriction is that the total will have, there'll be a section for attachments, and we'll talk about all the different supporting documents we will need in a sec. But the total size of all attachments may not exceed 20 megabytes. So at the end of the form, when you find your place to upload it, it'll include photos, it'll include budget, it'll include all these things we'll go over, but the total file size for all those attachments cannot exceed 20 megabytes. And one way you can check how much your total file size is if you put all the attachments in a file on your computer and click properties, you'll be able to see the size of that file and see if it's under that 20 megabyte limit. In general, most attachments we ask for are small enough in size to not present an issue with that. The one file that tends to cause issues is photos. So if you resize them down, if you have a big photo from a nice camera, resize it down like you might if you were going to put it on your website or something like that. And if you get an error message and nothing else is wrong, it's probably something to do with this 20 megabyte limit at the end. And also, we do have some that are starred. You'll see in my example on there, the amount of grant requests is starred. We have to have that information for obvious reasons. So if you do not fill out a field with a star, you'll also get an error message. Once the application is in, you'll get an auto confirmation message. And if there's anything in there that we need clarification on or any supplementary materials that we don't have that we need, I'll get in touch with you. So what do we need to know in this application? It is designed to be a quick and easy grant, so the questions you'll be asked are also simple and to the point. We are going to ask for basic contact information for your organization. We are going to ask for a title and location for the project, because we know often organizations and actual project locations have two separate addresses. We are going to ask for contact information for the property owner for the site, and if you do not own the site, we just need a letter of support from the owner so that we know that this work is approved by the owner and that they are in support of the work that you are applying for the grant for before we award that grant. So we will also ask for some background information on your organization, including your background in preservation work. We'll want to know the historic significance of the resources and any designations it may have, like National Register or Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties. And we'll also ask for a description of the project and what kind of deliverables will come from the funding. The application will ask how the project meets the criteria. And we will talk about that more in a moment, because this is one of those kind of hidden big questions. A lot of the meat of it is in how this project meets the grant criteria. So we'll get into that a bit more depth in a second. We'll also want to know an outline of the timetable and the source of your matching funds. And lastly, of course, as I said before, we need to know how much money you want. So we will ask for how much money you're applying for and how much the total cost of your project is. And just a little word about that, if you're doing a planning study to proceed with a larger restoration and you're asking to fund the planning study, we want to know the total cost of the planning study rather than, but for that total budget, total project budget. It is always good to include the larger cost of what you anticipate the restoration would be if you have that on hand. Or anything else that we kind of get a picture for what this is and you know, any prep work that you've done for that larger thing. But if it's a phase, if it's, for instance, restoring a doorway, we want the price of restoring that doorway as your grant amount rather than the whole building. And I hope that makes sense to everybody. So the last section of the grant is supplementary material. So we will now get into what do I need to have, and that is what the supplementary materials are. We do need to have, again, that cash or in-kind match of at least 10%. And as you'll see, some of these are required, do require work in advance. So with the September 15th deadline, a lot of these you should probably start working on if you're looking at applying a grant then. We are also going to ask for 2 or 3 representative photos of the project. One of these photos should be an overview photo, something that gives the committee a sense of the site as a whole, and the others can depend on the type of project. If you want funding for a particular feature, it should be a detailed photo of that feature. If it involves a whole structure, it could be other views of the site or the site in context of its surroundings. On the paperwork side, we're going to need your IRS determination letter of tax-exempt status and your latest financial statement or audit. And we're also going to need to see any estimates, plans, or proposals for the project as well. You will see there's just one upload slot for those items. If you have an estimate plus a strategic plan plus a site drawing, instead of emailing even extra, I just suggest the easiest thing would probably be to scan them and make them into one PDF and then attach that PDF. We're also going to ask to see your budget. As you remember, we ask in the main part of the grant just for total cost and match. This budget is a more detailed breakdown of how you arrived at those numbers. So if you're doing a particular section of a house, this is the breakdown of how that number is reached. We just want to know that there's, it hasn't just been randomly arrived at, that there's some thought process behind them that helps back that up. You will also need to show support. We ask for a minimum of 1 letter of support from an elected official. This is an area where there can always be more. So if you have other letters you would like us to see, if you get a lot of support from other elected officials, that's fine, but you do need to have at least one. And again, if you have multiple and they came to you, go ahead and scan them all into one document. And it's also fine if they prefer, because I know this is a preference from some places, if they prefer mailing them directly to our office. You can bring that to my attention. So just that would be the contact is our office address to my attention. And then you'll see on the supplementary material, I have a section for notes. Just mention this letter is being mailed. A letter of support from so-and-so will be mailed to your office. And that'll help me know to keep an eye out for it and also to make sure that it's not just missing. I'll know that it's on its way. And again, like I said before, if you are not the property owner, we are going to need to see a letter of support from that property owner. So that's a little bit about what you can expect when you approach the application and what kind of information you'll need to have. So now we'll get into how the projects are evaluated. And again, there's a lot of stuff up here, and this is all on our guidelines and application tab, so I'm not going to read absolutely everything. I'd rather talk a little bit about how the committee uses this information to evaluate projects. I mentioned a couple times we would come to this, and the factors, and these factors are truly the big things that to keep in mind while you're writing your grant. Find ways in your answer, every answer, not just the one about how it fits the criteria, to address these criteria. The last one that addresses geographic distribution is really the only one outside of your control. If a bunch of applications arrive from your area, you cannot help that. But in making sure that you have considered and addressed the other criteria is something you can do to separate your grant out. When you finish a draft, read through, or have someone removed from the project, read through your draft with a copy of these on hand and see if they can find how it meets these criteria in your application. So if you're wondering how to address these criteria, try turning it into a question. We'll use the example of provision for long-term resource preservation. So when you review your grant and you're seeing if you've addressed this, see if it answers, how does this project help us preserve this resource, not only in the short term, but maintain it into the future? Maybe if you're applying for an education program, it will be a component of an outreach campaign. If it's a restoration project, ask, is there also a plan that we have addressed that we are also working on cultivating a donor base or creating income generation in the anticipation of future preservation needs? Kind of thinking through the whole long-term of the project will help the committee see that you've thought about that criteria. So again, use that. We have that question that says, how does this address the criteria? But please think about these criteria in every answer. So for instance, you can talk about your administrative capability in the answer where you describe your organization. We have a criteria for readiness of the applicant to initiate and complete the project. When you have we have a question about the timeline. Think about how you can show your readiness through that answer on the timeline. Rather than just writing out some dates, you can use the word limit that you have in there to really show that you're ready to go, this is set up, the groundwork has been laid, and once this funding comes in, we're set. And so I think, yeah, so the demonstrative and innovative value of the project or products, you can use this in the products and reports section. We have a question on what products will result from this grant. And you can let us know how you plan that this project might stimulate other preservation activities. So I hope that kind of gives you a little idea of how you can use the whole grant to really talk about these criteria. Because this, again, is what comes up when the committee needs to kind of sit down and evaluate them, or has this question been answered? Has this grant answered it better than that grant? So just those really are the ones. So again, read, reread, have others read, fresh eyes to make sure that they can find these criteria in your grant. Oh, sorry, and here also the extent to which the project stimulates and promotes other preservation activities. Yeah, we just want to make sure that you're using creatively the grants to do that kind of work. So we've gone through the application process. We've gone through how the committee kind of takes a look at them and evaluates them. So what happens if you do get a grant? You filled out a grant, you get your confirmation message, and like I said, it takes about 8 weeks following the deadline to be in touch with the decisions of the committee. It can depend on schedules and other factors like that. So if you do get a grant, you will get a call from us followed by a letter, and it'll provide a link to an online acceptance form. And so really, this is a super simple form, much simpler even than the grant, which is pretty simple itself. We just need to know who you are, need you to check that you have read and understood all the grant conditions, and we need to attach a PDF of a W-9 form. The W-9, if we don't have a W-9, we can't pay you, so that is a very important part, I think, for everyone to make sure that we have that. And there is a link to the website. The IRS has these on their website in fillable PDFs that if you don't happen to have one on hand, which you might, but more likely you probably don't, you can click that link, fill it out, save it, and then attach it to the acceptance form. And then you get to work. And like I said, the grant is good for 1 year from the time you receive your letter. And we fully understand that not every project goes like clockwork. So it's not a totally uncommon thing for projects to go beyond their original time frame. That is why the most important thing you can do for us after you get your award letter is to stay in touch. If I have not heard from you and your 1 year time frame is closing in, I'm going to start reaching out to get a project update. If you do not hear back, if I do not hear back from you, we can recall the grant. So staying in touch is how you make sure that we know what's going on and your grant does not get recalled. And we do not want to recall the grant. It's not what we want. We want you to do the work. We want you to do the work. So if you keep in touch, it's more likely than not we can work out a plan to help make sure that that work happens. As a condition of the grant, one of the things that when you get your acceptance form you'll check to is that credit must be given to Preservation Maryland and the Maryland Historical Trust on materials and publicity. So please make sure that as you work, you're factoring that requirement in as well. And it varies from project to project how that happens, but we do need to make sure that that both Preservation Maryland and the Maryland Historical Trust are included in materials and publicity. So once the project is complete, we will send you a link to a disbursement form. And it's just going to ask for a brief paragraph on how the project went. We're going to want proof of payment, which means copies of checks or credit card receipts, and an invoice from the contractor showing that this money went to the work that was stated in your grant. And we also ask for pictures, or if you haven't done a building, if it's been more of a project, then we just want to see some kind of documentation for projects that can't necessarily be photographed. If it was something like putting up signage, we'll want photos of signage. If it was for a brochure, we're going to want to see photos of the brochure. If it was a research project, a copy of the finished report. So there's lots of ways to prove that outside of for the projects that maybe don't necessarily have photographs to them. So once we get all of that, we can write you a check. And partial payments are possible. If you finish a sizable chunk of the work and then you kind of run into a roadblock, and it would be helpful to get reimbursement for the work, part of the work that you've done, but you haven't expended all of your grant funds, that's totally possible. You just need to do this process for that phase of the project and explain a little bit about the roadblock, and just so I know when to check in with you again when you anticipate that roadblock getting moved, and you know, we can talk through that, like I said, to stay in touch. So we can definitely do that. Just let us know how much you need at that time, And it doesn't have to be an even half or anything. If you have 1/3 of the work done, we can reimburse for 1/3 of that amount. So the other thing is that grant awardees can apply for the same project or site after 1 year from the award date. I will always caution that in the desire to spread the Heritage Fund's limited resources, back-to-back awards on the same project are sometimes a little hard to come by. So it's not impossible by any means, but that is something that's evaluated on a project-to-project basis. And just know that there is kind of a desire to make sure that we're not funding the same 5 organizations over and over again, which is something that there's so many great projects, and I'm going to get to the next slide, that it's always a challenge to make those decisions. So good segue into what happens if I don't get a grant. Please, my thing is like, please do not despair, please do not feel bad. This is a very competitive grant program, and so good projects may not get funded. For instance, in the last round, we had over 40 projects that applied for funding, and we could only fund 10. So there were a lot of really good projects that just, for a variety of reasons, again, it can be small little things, do not get funded. So if you do not get funding in a grant round, you will get a letter in the mail with some feedback from the committee meeting. We want to help you know why that grant funding was not received. And if you want to call or email me, my phone number and email will always be on those letters, and please do so. Please get in touch if you want to talk it out. I'm certainly more than happy to sit and talk to anyone about their project or about how the decision-making kind of move forward as far as what might be helpful in the next round. And which brings me to that you can certainly reapply. And you don't have to wait for 1 year. You can reapply in the next round. But again, please reach out to me first, because you know, I am in on that committee meeting, so I am there to help get that feedback and get it to you. So it would be a helpful thing, so that in case there was something that they really were unclear about, that you can help. I can point that out to you, and we can talk it through and see if we can make it more clear in the next grant round. And also, more rarely, this is a much more rare circumstance, the committee concludes in the discussion that it's just not the right fit for the program. And certainly, if that was the result, I would want you to get in touch with me before you reapply, because I would want to talk to you about that and why we reached that decision. So if you did not get a grant, please take a look at the letter, get in touch with me if you want to reapply. So before we go into questions that anyone might have through the webinar, I wanted to kind of go over some of the ones that I get most commonly when people call in to Preservation Maryland to go through the grant. First question is, can an individual or a private business apply? As we talked about, the answer is no. Only nonprofits in local jurisdictions can submit an application. A private business or homeowner is not eligible for the Heritage Fund. Second, can I apply for work that is already completed? The answer to that is also no. While the grant is reimbursable, the work in the application cannot have already been finished. If you want Heritage Fund funding for a project that you are in the middle of, please apply for a future phase of the project or another aspect of the project. We can't fund something that you've already done. So the next question is, can I use this grant for match on other grants? And the answer to that is yes. While the Maryland Historical Trust is a partner, this grant can be used as match for other grants, including other state grants. And we do have, as you'll see, one of the requirements are that all work must conform to the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. And so I get a lot, what are the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation? I have the website up here, and it's going to be on our last slide as well. And so these are 10 standards issued from the Interior Department to guide the rehabilitation process by preserving and protecting those features that define that building. And so this link up here is also linkable on our website. If you go to guidelines and application, we mentioned it has to conform. You'll see that that's a hyperlink. So if you click on that, that'll also take you to those standards so you can review them. And I'd like to add, too, that if your building falls any other kind of local jurisdiction, for instance, if it's a historic district with its own set of guidelines, you must follow those as well. And you must also go through the appropriate review process with your local commissions if you have them. So this is kind of the standard for our grant, but we want to make sure that the work is also complying with any local rules that you might have. So please review these guidelines and make sure the work you are planning complies with them before you submit your application. And that's another way to, you don't have to get into the ins and outs of how it complies, but that's certainly something that the committee does look at to make sure that that is compliant work. So the next question is, does my contractor need experience with historic buildings? And I'm going to say no, but at a big but. It's not a firm requirement, but you will see a question in the grant about who the contractor is and what that contractor's experience is with preservation work. And this answer, like all answers, will influence the committee's decision. So I would really urge you to ask that question of your contractor, and it's always going to look better on the grant to have someone that has experience with historic preservation, is familiar with the Secretary of Interior standards, has that kind of background. That's always a plus. And if you're curious where you find those kind of contractors, Preservation Maryland maintains a contractor directory. It's preservelist.org, and I will have that up at the for the last slide as well, that you can write that down. But they have contractors in different locations and with different specialties that you can take a look at if you need someone to help you along. So if I do not receive a grant in this round, can I apply in the next round? And that answer is yes. You can. There is no waiting period. If you were an applicant in April and you did not get a grant, you are more than welcome to apply this upcoming grant round. And again, just please get in touch with me first. We would just hate to have a frustrating process for everyone if we haven't talked about it through and then the committee has the same questions the second go round, because we haven't been able to talk through what the issue was. So I have up some key info. First off is my contact. Again, my name is Jessica Feldt. I'm the Preservation Initiatives Manager here. That's my email, jfeldt@presmd.org, and you can reach me at 410-685-2886, extension 302. The second link is the link I had up before with the direct link to the Heritage Fund website. And the nice thing about that link is that all the other links are also on there, including my contact info. And it has full guidelines and a link to the online application if you want to review both of those. It also has a link to the Secretary of Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. And again, our contractor directory is preservelist.org. If you are looking for a preservation professional to work with you on your project, that's a great way to start getting some names. So now I'd like to open it up if anyone has any questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Ellie, are you?
Nope, I think it doesn't seem like we do, but again, anyone with questions can contact Jessica, and she's more than happy to help. So, and a recording of this will be available on the website along with other supplementary materials. So again, those will be at presmd.org/HF. So thank you for everybody for tuning in. Thank you, Jessica, for walking us all through that. And everyone have a fantastic rest of the afternoon.
Bye.